Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the MUTEK Recorder. My name is still Claire L. Evans. I'm a writer and musician based in Los Angeles, California, aka the unceded indigenous ancestral lands of the Tongva and Chumash peoples. With me in the ether, in the cloud, invisible but very present, is the Holo magazine editorial team, who spent this morning, as they will every morning of the next 2 weeks, live documenting the conversations that are happening in real time during the forum. They have been hard at work gathering references, quotes, citations, big takes, learnings, and other musings, and posting them in real time to the Holo magazine website in this evolving dossier that is part of this MUTEK Recorder project. It's a publishing sprint in real time. It's a living document. It's hectic. It's amazing. I'll be sharing some sort of highlights from the daily dossier every day in this live stream, but I hope that you take the time to browse it on your own time because it's really a super impressive synthesis of everything that's going on during this conference, and I think it will spark your own thinking about your MUTEK experience. If you caught yesterday's recorder, then you bore witness to the first very live trial run of this format, which I think went off as well as it could have. We had a discussion of Benjamin Bratton's kickoff keynote. We talked about NFTs, and then we had a visit from the designer and sound artist Yuri Suzuki. Every day, we will be joined by a special guest who will share their own interpretation of the prompt of recording in their practice. So thank you for joining us. And before we get to today's guest, let's talk a little bit about what happened this morning at the forum and look at the dossier and reflect on some highlights. We kicked off this morning with a very beautiful, I thought, conversation between Sava Saheli Singh and Sabrina Calvo. I didn't really know what to expect from this one, but I found myself, taking notes about as fast as I could write them. Calvo has an expansive practice, I learned, spanning writing, game design, and more recently, textile work and fashion design, which she loves, despite, she says, being bad at it, which I love. That I can relate to that. I love the graceful way that she talked about the immaterial and material aspects of art making and all these sort of beautiful correlations that emerge when you're working across mediums in this way. For example, the practice of sewing by hand, she said, brought her back to the practice of writing by hand after she realized how much of writing exists in the gesture and passes through the gesture. I thought that was a very beautiful observation and something I've experienced as well. What emerges from the pen is so different than what emerges from the keyboard, likely because writing with a pen and paper, there's sort of this single point of focus, this direct line from the mind through the body to the pen and to the page, whereas typing, on the other hand, requires this kind of awkward forking of focus where our eyes are landing on the screens, but our hands are down below on the keyboard doing their own thing. Calvo talked about dreams too, about the project of making dreams manifest, and I think that does require a certain fluid and frictionless relation between body and mind. All the best artists know that dreams are an infinite free resource. I often joke with a visual artist friend of mine that cribbing from our dreams is like a consequence-free plagiarism of the unconscious. After that, we caught a quick tour of Google Arts and Culture's attempt to map the history and materiality of electronic music, which took the form of a kind of archive exhibition called Music Makers and Machines. Super ambitious project. I'm always fascinated by the attempt to map something as nebulous and ephemeral as music, as electronic music. I mean, of course, its pioneers and places deserve an archive of their own, and I certainly get a kick out of looking at a rave flyer being treated like an illuminated manuscript or something. But ultimately what we're dealing with here is a feeling, and what electronic music achieves at its peak, I'm sure we all know this, is a sort of fleeting, intoxicating feeling of bliss and connectedness. And I'm not 100% sure that pinching and zooming an AR model of a Moog will get us there. What might get us there, though, is the subject of the next panel that we watched today, Sound is the Object, Creative Approaches to Mindful Sonic Experiences, which tackled the question, how can sound most meaningfully and efficiently be used in meditation? There were some technical difficulties at the top of this panel, which I'm sure a robust meditation practice enabled its participants to weather without stress. But I found it to be a really interesting conversation, especially the contributions of the neuroscientist on the panel, Dr. Lucas Bols, who kind of put a more clear definitional frame around this rather loose idea of attention. He pointed out attention's evolutionary role in keeping us alive to this point, and shared how the brain's attentional systems work together and sometimes against one another. So our brains have these three systems, apparently, which constantly interact to guide our attention. There's an alerting network, which is like our predator warning system in the brainstem. There's an orienting network, which helps us to focus on specific elements, like to draw out the distinction between a beat and a melody while listening to music, for example. And then kind of an executive network, which sort of delegates and filters. So attention is not just this one thing to be harnessed, it's all these different systems. And we don't have any direct control over those systems. But what was really interesting about this neuroscience conversation, where it got into really brain-bending territory, was when Dr. Voll started pointing out that our brains construct an internal model of the world that constantly is predicting what is going to happen next, which means that effectively our experience in any given moment, our sort of perceptual experience of life, is not what's actually happening around us in the moment. Sort of resonates with our attempts to document this festival in real time and be ready for these daily streams. But our brains are constantly creating these subjective illusions of reality, which then become our reality. So how can we get access to that internal model and improve it? That was sort of the question of the day in the panel. Dr. Voll suggested that sound is a way in, actually, because especially music, which has repetitive rhythms and patterns, it can kind of tickle that internal model's predictive mechanisms. And perhaps we can start making kind of tweaks based on different parameters and specifications. And I found this unexpected relationship between perception, time, and sound to be really fascinating. It sort of lended a measure of scientific rigor to the whole premise of mindfulness, but it also sort of explains the primal appeal of music more generally. This is tangential, but years ago, I interviewed the late neurologist, Dr. Oliver Sacks, who had at the time just written a book about music and the brain called Musicophilia, which if you're into this kind of stuff, I highly recommend. It sort of paints a really interesting picture of some edge cases that tell us a lot about music and the brain. Anyway, he was telling me, I remember that like rhythm is something that's really hardwired to our evolutionary history. We can't not respond to rhythm. Even if we're nodding our heads or tapping our feet, the motor parts of our brain are responding to rhythm. And so this is something that appears simultaneously in every child, but it's not something you can train a chimpanzee to do. It's not something that any other animal, mammal can do. You can't train a bird or a whale or an elephant to keep synchronized time to rhythm. It's a specifically human attribute, which Sachs told me he felt was probably something that we evolved independently and then preserved because it has a sort of reliable evolutionary advantage. It helps us to bond, to do things together, to synchronize social groups. So perhaps that attribute, that inborn response to rhythm and repetition, can be leveraged by meditative music sound practitioners to unlock further vistas of the human mind. I can't help, of course, but think of Paulina Oliveras and her deep listening practice and her 1974 text, Sonic Meditations, which is a book of text scores and recipes for deep listening. It includes prompts like, listen to a sound until you can no longer recognize it, and focus your attention on an external source of constant sound while imagining a different sound simultaneously. These are prompts that Oliveras came to intuitively, but they seem to be sort of custom designed to tickle the brain's competing attentive systems and its internal predictive models and all of that. So we'll include a PDF of Oliveras' Sonic Meditations in the references section of today's dossier. I'm going to give you a glimpse of the dossier before I leave you to our guest, although hopefully it is live by now. It may not be. No, it's not yet. Okay, well, on your own time, go ahead and check out today's dossier. It has a discussion of all of these subjects, as well as a deep dive into the really fascinating Q&A that was held just before this session with the artist and software developer Sarah Friend, who discussed a number of intricate conceptual projects which use software as site-specific media, including one of the most interesting crypto art projects I've seen, I guess, ever, called Off, an NFT project that's simultaneously an artist edition, an artwork, and a multiplayer game simultaneously. I highly encourage you to check that out. But anyway, lots to dig in, lots to talk about, not a lot of time. So I'm going to skip us ahead to our guest talk. Today, my guest is the distinguished designer and researcher Mindy Seu. a deep thinker in publishing, research, and archives, known for such projects, in this household anyway, for the Cyberfeminism Index, which is a vital archive compiling decades of techno-feminist thinking, which is commissioned by Rhizome and presented by the New Museum. A book is forthcoming in 2022, which I'm very psyched to read. She's been a fellow at the Internet Archive, a designer at the Museum of Modern Art, is currently assistant professor at Yale School of Art. Further bona fides are too long to list here, but she has a really excellent spreadsheet on her website, which you can consult on your own time. If you have any questions for Mindy, please ask them in the chat. They will be relayed to me somehow, and I will ask them on your behalf. We'll have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions after the presentation, if I can shut up. Okay, Mindy, welcome. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. I don't know if anyone glimpsed this, but in Claire's widescreen view, she has a nameplate on her bookshelf that says Claire L. Evans, Cyberfeminist. Yeah, there we go.
That's for you.
Into the I also wanted to say a quick thank you to Greg and Alex from the Holo team. So thank you for the invitation. And I was asked specifically to talk about some of the design influences behind the Cyberfeminism Index. So I'll be going through those today. Should I begin screen sharing now?
Go for it.
Cool. All right, let me toggle this on. All right, so you're going to see a website called mindyseu.com/sharing. This is part of a longer talk, so I kind of sped forward to the Talmud. And if you pop under the hood in the inspector, you'll have my lecture notes. So feel free to refer to this later on if you want citations or links. Just a quick shout out to Emma Ray Bremmel, who first did this HTML comments as lecture for Melanie Hoff's class at the School for Poetic Computation. I also wanted to, before I kind of dig in and speed through this, is for me, I was thinking about the record in 2 forms, really as its noun and its verb. So for the Cyberfeminism Index, the verb form is really how you are recording this revisionist history in progress and retroactively, but also thinking about the record. So what is the shape of this final form or index? How does it move through various translations, spreadsheet, website, book? And today I'll just be talking about the influences for the website. So I'm gonna inch this down a bit and scroll through this a bit as well. So the Talmud is a primary theological and religious text of Judaism, but it's also a primary influence for the modern concept of digital hypertext. So in the center, you have the Mishnah. The outermost columns, you have scholars talking about the Mishnah. And in the outermost column, you have scholars talking about the scholarship in the internal column. So built into the structure of the page, you kind of have this dialectic of different voices. And this is actually Ted Nelson from a screenshot of his YouTube channel holding up this page of the Talmud to talk about how it influenced his idea of hypertext. Just a quick note to say that hypertext has really been around since the origins of the printed word. So if you think about bibliographies, footnotes, indexes, all of these things really influence the cross-referencing systems that we currently see as hyperlinks. So this is actually a screenshot, or sorry, a page from the Whole Earth Millennium Catalog. So we're on page 70. If this blurb interested you, you could jump forward to page 90 about restoration forestry. In an early or late 90s book about cyberfeminism, they used this eye icon in the margins to allow you to hop between different sections of this book. So it's a very analog way of pushing and pulling through this world encompassed between this front and back cover. So this is actually a still from Xanadu's Space. Xanadu was Ted Nelson's version of his early concept of the internet before the World Wide Web. This is Xanadu's Space. What's nice about Xanadu is in some ways it's very similar to a lot of the websites that we see today and recognize. You have this long scrolling center column, but here what's unique is if you were to cite any of these additional quotes, it actually pulls the reference in context of the original source. So you can see here all the other pages that were used to build the central page, really thinking about the multiplicity of authorship, which I think is a tenet of cyberfeminism. For me, I was really thinking about how do we visualize citations. So this is just an alternate view of Xanadu's space. Here, there were other scholars at this time who were also thinking about how to pull in depth and motion and 3 dimensions into, unfortunately, what's now like a pretty flat space, though that's changing through other technologies. But again, you have these various pages and the citations are made visible connections between all the different references and embeds. This is an Arena channel that I embedded about the politics of citation if you want to find more references, but I won't get into this here. So not only was I trying to think about how to visualize citations, I also wanted to think about how can you quote unquote future-proof a website to the best of our ability now, right? Like how can this be a record several decades into the future or even 1 year into the future? I'm sure as many of you know, link rot is quite prolific and websites created these days aren't really made to last. So this site was actually built in 1997 by Cornelia Solfrank, who was one of the members of the Old Boys Network. This website was created for the first Cyberfeminists International, which was a convening of cyberfeminists across Europe. And the content of this is rather than defining cyberfeminism, it's giving 100 antitheses or anti-definitions as to what it is not. So again, really promoting this multiplicitous angle. But from a design perspective, it's actually quite a beautiful site because I actually checked a month ago and they're redesigning Old Boys Network right now, but you can still find this on the Wayback Machine. But when I checked late last year, nearly 25 years later, this site was still working perfectly because they were using all these default HTML form elements and very standard CSS. So you have the CSS color blue, you have basic line elements, you're just using Arial, which is one of the only system fonts is co-designed by a woman, Patricia Saunders, for IBM. You have these drop downs that are quite default. So what's nice about this is pre-redesign, this site still worked perfectly, even if they didn't intend for it to last for so long, because it was kind of no frills. It ended up kind of becoming this larger record of this convening from 97. Another example of how websites age is this form art piece by Alexei Shulgin from 1997. So here, this was actually from the Rhizomes NetArt anthology. It's a still of this work where he uses these very bureaucratic form elements like buttons and text fields and doesn't style the elements themselves. He just changes the composition on the page. So what this does is basically create like this concrete poetic text that's quite interactive. If you click through here, it would trigger various animations and pop-ups. But when you look at this site today, it looks like this. What's really nice about this is structurally it's very similar, but because he didn't style any of the form elements, it was able to design itself over time as the browser updated. So I really love this idea of how a website could age with a browser. So you have a white background, you have these smaller buttons, this gray drop shadow, rounded edges, and all of these things quite modernize it, but still very much nod to its growth from the original, without a touch or any interference from Alexei Shulgin. So I'm not going to click into this, but if you, this is the live link, you'll actually see the project cyberfeminismindex.com. So this was created over a period of about a year with my collaborator, Angeline Meitzler, with front-end support from Janine Rosen and PDF support from Charles Bruskowski from Arena. And I'll just play this video for you. When you first arrive, this glowing element is the loading function. It kind of snaps into place. It looks like a pretty standard table. Again, using Arial. We did make some bespoke typographic things, but that's for a graphic designer to nerd out about. And then as you scroll through, everything that you click is captured in what we're calling the side panel trail. So this is, whether intuitive or intentional, trying to build the connections between what's catching your eye or what you're trying to build upon. There's also an image view for this page, which I won't show here. Similar to the analog hyperlinks I was talking about, we also embedded a lot of cross-references to either juxtapose or support a lot of the different entries. There are over 750 entries in this index currently and growing. It is partly crowdsourced. If you were to go to the side panel trail, this menu or the video bar is kind of covering it, but there are two buttons that says download and view all downloads. If you clicked download, it actually render a PDF of all the things that you clicked. I generally am pro piracy, so I wanted to think about how people could create a reader of the things that they found relevant in the index. And also, archivists understand, I'm not an archivist by training, but I would say an archival enthusiast. Duplicating things is kind of key, especially in a digital format. So the Internet Archive, for example, has 3 different server farms across the world, just in case one of them fails. And the view all downloads would basically show you what other people downloaded at different times with their timestamp and their IP address. And in these last 4 minutes, I just wanted to quickly give some concrete examples of some entries in the index. So this is a screenshot of one of the pop-ups from Bindi Girl, or Prema Murthy's Bindi Girl, which was really thinking about the fetishization of specifically South Asian women online, especially as the advent of porn was getting more and more prolific. This is what I'm calling an artifact from Cloud Kinki's Brutal Myths, which was talking about the history of gynecology and obstetrics. One of the graphics from Skawanetti's Cyber Powwow, which was one of the first Indigenous online communities based in Canada that was online. Another artifact from the African Declaration of Internet Rights and Freedoms. And the logo for genderchangers.org, which was a hackerspace and a learning environment based in Europe that was thinking about this gear, Gender Changer, to change, not only teach people hardware, the imports and outports of different tools and wires, but also really thinking about how technology is itself a construction, or sorry, gender is a technological construction. Mujeres in Red, this was the logo for a Latin hack feminist group that still exists today. And I always like ending with this bumper or sticker from the Canadian World or Women's Web Ring, WW Women. So back in the day, before there were suggestions and related searches, if you were part of this online network, you can actually put this sticker on your website and it would randomly transport you to the website of another peer within this network. So I thought it was a quite nice way to show some locality in what otherwise seems like this very ephemeris, nebulous space. But with that, in my speedy 10-minute talk, I'll stop sharing and Claire and I can chat. Let me toggle back.
Amazing. I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. So thoughtful, so many beloved references in there. Just a delight. Okay, I have a question for you. We may have an audience question come down the pike, but for now, I have a question for you, which is that in my experience, like doing any kind of project that collates or tells stories or archives material created by people who are still alive necessarily kind of involves the blossoming of a lot of interpersonal relationships. Like I imagine you probably had to get in touch with quite a lot of people to build this index, and that might have brought those people in touch with one another again or for the first time. So I'm just curious, like how you see the relationship between archives and communities and how they can create or inform one another.
Totally, yeah. I think maybe there's an anecdote that I like. So this project originally started as trying to be an archive for the New Woman Survival Catalog, which was created in the late 70s and was the feminist Whole Earth Catalog. And when you read about the history of how they created this, which was the resource compendium of grassroots feminist activism, second wave, they literally took a car from Colombia and drove it across the US into California. And along the way, stopped at various bookstores and educational centers and rape centers to basically build this resource guide for women of the time. So when I first talked to those authors, they're basically like, activism can never happen within the walls of an institution. You kind of have to go grassroots. So in this way, I started building the Cyberfeminism Index by reading all of these like academic papers and scraping their bibliographies. But ultimately, that just led me to talk to a lot of people who aren't typically included in these academic papers. And it was just this network effect of people suggesting other people. So many phone calls. I think my phone call was the equivalent of their road trip, let's say. It was also kind of during pandemic times. And then now at this point, it's crowdsourced. So I do moderate it, but once it was announced by the new museum, there was this flood of interest for wanting to be included or excluded, which was an interesting thing to navigate. But now I feel like it's growing quite nicely.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, it's funny describing these people driving across the country. It's like an IRL hypertext trail or desire path.
Desire lines, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's funny. In my experience, like doing any kind of archival research with the web, you end up relying a lot weirdly on like these old sort of print books that were published that were like, you know, the yellow pages of the World Wide Web, like indexes that just have like screenshots of different websites, and then they're long URLs that you just type into the Wayback Machine to see if they still exist. Did you do a lot of that stuff too?
So much of that. I feel like a lot of these things have been written about, but they're not, because of link rot, they just don't exist anymore. The URLs died, the people do various things. So a lot of like web archival searches, but found through these papers and these screenshots. Like broadband was a huge influence. And another one of your projects, Deep Lab, is also in the project. So I think it's also like our local community and trying to like bridge that out into some of these more classical seminal inclusions. It was I think it's a nice blend. It's nice how it's evolved over time.
It's also really beautiful that it's going to return to a physical book in the end, because, you know, that's how things end up being preserved the longest, really. I mean, until we get our shit together in terms of archiving the web properly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really was, we decided to print it for two reasons. One, posterity. Like these days, books definitely last longer than websites. But it was also kind of like a citational hack. Many papers within an academic sense value the printed page more than a website or like a URL.
Yeah.
So for us, it was just a way to provide secondary sources.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I was a total delight. Tomorrow, guests, the forum will host panels and workshops about digital sovereignty, critical NFT studies, sustainability, and volume in music. We'll be soaking it all up and squeezing it back out to you. We'll see what happens with that. Your guess is as good as mine. My guest tomorrow will be Samane Moafi, a senior researcher at Forensic Architecture, a research agency investigating human rights violations around the world. While we have a couple of minutes, I wanted to honor my collaborators and show you today's dossier live, because we didn't get a chance to earlier. This is kind of what happens when you're dealing with things that go live moments before you are talking about them online. So here we have today's dossier, a deep dive into this morning's questions. As you can see, quotations, images, references, and citations for you to dig, and as well as my own profound commentary, of course, for you to enjoy on your own time and to study. We have a lot of quotes from the Sarah Friend Q&A. We have a lot of things to examine. Some images from Sarah Friend's upcoming crypto art project, Off, which of course I discussed a little bit earlier in the presentation. Anyway, if you want to spend more time with this, please do. It's right here. The URL is in the upper left-hand corner. Go wild. And in the interim, please enjoy your evening, and we will see you tomorrow. We will see you tomorrow for the return of the MUTEK Recorder. Thank you so much.